morning, everyone. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Customer Experience Group. Thank you all so much again for joining us to talk about the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 2 meeting related to the transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation. I'm here today again with my colleagues, Debbie Levine, who is the facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes, who is our scribe for today. We're also joined by Phil Pettingill, who is the coordinator overseeing all three of the active EDAM working groups. The meetings for this specific working group are held weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific. And you can find the participation details on the ISO's public calendar. And on the next slide, we have some courtesy reminders before I hand it over to Debbie. These working groups are intended to be collaborative in nature, and we encourage participants to share ideas and perspectives throughout. And I just want to make sure I'm still seeing the title slide. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks. And we'll be taking questions throughout. To do so, please raise your hand virtually using the virtual raise hand icon, unless you happen to dial in separately, in which case you would dial #2. We will be taking verbal questions only today, as is the case usually for these meetings. And as is always the case as well, these are recorded and the video files posted on the corresponding working group web pages. And we please request that you request permission from the ISO before printing any related transcriptions. And as you also may know, stakeholders are always welcome to present perspectives at these meetings. Please submit a request to do so using the link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. And also on that same slide here at the end of this deck, the materials related to the working group meetings are posted on the associated webpage, along with other helpful links to help you engage in this process. And on the next slide, we have the agenda for today, which Debbie will be going over. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we'll be discussing the transmission availability buckets, as well as the timing and duration topic. And with that, I'll hand it over to Debbie to continue the discussion. I think you might be double muted, Debbie.
I am double muted. Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Jimmy. What I wanted to do first underneath the transmission availability is tease out a little bit more on the existing contracts. Next slide, please. So I put together a very simple example, and the example is balancing EDAM Balancing Authority Area 1, Balancing Authority Area 2. There's a generator in Balancing Authority 1, and the entity, in essence, has internal transmission rights to get to a certain substation, A, and then you've got transfer rights to get across the Balancing Authority Area to Balancing Authority Area 2, which is substation B. And then you have internal rights from substation B to load 3. That's, in essence, what I would call contract example 1. And for the, as we discussed earlier, we would be using contract reference numbers. So CRN stands for contract reference numbers. And then if you were getting generation from generator 2 to load 3, that's just an internal transmission right. So from generator 2 to load 3 is an internal transmission right. Next slide, please. So one of the things to consider is that buckets that we're talking about are in essence solely talking about the transfers from BA to BA. The internal transmission rights are not part of the bucket. They're actually included in the full network model that is used to optimize the market. Now, we can still go ahead and reserve the rights for the internal transmission and for the transfers but they're set up separately. And I think this is one of the areas where we haven't been very clear as to what's in the buckets versus what's in the full network model. So next slide, please. So the registration, this is the same slide that George showed you. In essence, it's, source and sync. What are the different contract paths that you have? So is it A to B to the load, or is it the generator 2 to load 3? We'd still need to know what that contract path is. Or if you have a flow gate, then you'd have flow gate information. It can be shared by multiple transmission contracts. So if the EIM entity has 10 people they've sold rights to from generator 1 to A, then that's fine. We'll do as a percentage or as a megawatt entitlement what the capacity is for that exact entity. And so then, as we discussed also on Tuesday, we would be registering in the master file, the thought is, at this point, the OAT rate. So these haven't changed. And with respect to bucket 3 transfers, the reason why I kept it on as an existing contract is I believe that the EIM entities do have contract rights that are part of what they joint ownership transmission lines, as an example. So I could see where they could have a contract right that would result in bucket 3 if they haven't used their whole entitlement on the joint ownership right, and it was, in essence, then made available on OASIS because the ATC wasn't fully used for those joint rights. If I could have any of the EIM entities chime in on, does that construct exist? Based on my knowledge, I believe it does. And so there's a possibility that existing contracts could be in bucket 3, but I just wanted to confirm my assumption on that. So Dave or Kathy, Kevin, anybody at APS, SRP? Anybody awake this morning?
Thanks, Debbie. You can push pound 2 if you dial in separately, or raise hand icon for the operator to identify your line if you want to speak up. Thanks.
Yeah, I think I just saw Dave Rubin. Operator, could you open Dave Rubin's line?
Sure, no problem. Let me find him.
Thanks, Debbie. I agree with you in the sense that, to me, bucket 3 is any transmission that is marketed on our OASIS. And so,
right.
I don't know if we may not have any of that particular type now, but it certainly, can exist in the region and others might have it, but it's sort of consistent with that notion that it's anything that we're marketing under our OASIS that hasn't been sold yet.
Okay, great. And Kevin Smith? Adam, can you open Kevin's line, please?
No problem. And just so everyone knows, you should probably only press the raise hand icon once. Otherwise, if you press it again, it'll lower your hand and make it harder. There you go, Kevin.
Hey. Hi, thanks. Hey, Debbie. Actually, I put my hand down. David covered it. But I think you captured it. It's just that, I think Dave gave the nuance.
Yes. Okay.
And it's Kevin with Bank. Thank you.
All right, thanks. All right, next slide, please. So how the rights would be used in the day-ahead market once they're registered is, in essence, you can self-schedule them. So you have a balanced resource against the demand, and then you'd use the contract reference number that has previously been registered. So CRN1 would get generation from generator 1 all the way to load 3, or if you were to use CRN2, then you're going from generator 2 to load 3. And if you don't want to have a balance schedule where you're in essence guaranteed that you are going to use those transmission rights, you could also put in an economic bid for the resource or the demand using the contract reference number. So in that case, what would happen is that only to the extent that the economic bid was taken would the contract reference number be used to link the two, instead of guaranteeing that you have that right to go between the two generations, the generator and the load, sorry. And so then, because it is registered, then EDAM can validate and confirm that the right person is using the contract reference number, the path is the contract path that is allowed for that entity, and the contract type, firm transmission, is consistently used throughout the EDAM process. If contract rights are not scheduled in EDAM, then what ends up happening is that the entity would have to schedule or bid either generation, import, or export using that contract reference number in the EIM. And that would then result in a redispatch of the market to meet that contract right. So with that, we have a question from Alva.
Hi, Deb. This is Alva Svoboda at PG&E. This is really educational. Thank you. But the one thing I don't understand from the perspective of having been an IFM participant is how the demand gets self-scheduled in that construct. Can you explain that? Because I'm used to the idea that demand is simply part of a load bid, and there would be no particular assignment to in that kind of match. So if you could just explain that, that would be real helpful to me.
So load and demand, sorry. I've been in the ISO for too many years and too involved with the tariff when it first started up. Demand and load are synonymous in the way that you're using load. Right. So resource, you have generation is balanced against load, and you can use a contract reference number to get between the two. So it's the same way with inside CAISO.
Okay, so that would be a load bid, but it would some portion of it be assigned, or is it the entire? Is this a participating load, or is a non-participating load, right? So
it's a non-participating load.
Okay, so how would that be just in the day-ahead market? It would just be a single bid at a contract lap? Is that how? I mean, how does it get separated out from other load bids that are typically put in the IFM?
So, George, do you want to explain that a little bit better?
Yes, thank you, Debbie. Hi, Alva. This is George Angelidis from the ISO. So in the IFM, in the day-ahead market in general, these exercise of the contracts are shown with self-schedules, and now on the load side, you have the ability to submit a self-schedule for a load, and the load that is associated with this particular transmission contract is modeled different from the general load that you have on the default load aggregation point. More likely, it has a custom load aggregation, a CLAP as we call it, so that it's more specific instead of being widespread all over the IOU territory or the greater area. And the participant that wants to exercise that transmission contract, they can submit a load self-schedule of the same type that is under the contract associated with the CRN. So same way like for the supplier. So if you have like an ETC, an existing transmission contract, then you submit an ETC self-schedule for the supply, for the resource, or the resources that provide the energy, and then an ETC load self-schedule for the load. And that if they're balanced, we validate that they're balanced and they meet the entitlement, they don't exceed the entitlement, they get their scheduling priority. And if there's a financial right, we handle it in settlements afterwards. In real time, you don't have the ability to submit, of course, a load self-schedule because there's no load bids. So there we make the connection with the meter that is submitted for that load.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Yeah, I think it does. So there's the constraint is it has to be a self-schedule, and it would be in general it would be at a custom lap rather than a DLAP. So it has a different form from the typical non-participating load bid, where the self-schedule would have no particular meaning except as a price taker. So, great. Thank you.
That's right.
Thank you, Alva. Callie Wells.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I actually kind of was hoping you can elaborate a little bit more on how the usage of contract rights when they're economically offered. So that second sub-bullet in EDAM. I guess what I'm trying to understand is if they economically offer the resource and demand and they specify the contract right that connects the two, and going back to your example where there could be multiple paths from the generator one to the load, what happens if maybe there's congestion management that has to happen on like that internal path? Is there a way to make sure that if it's respected, I guess, that it flows all the way through kind of like wheels in the CAISO? Or could it be that if there's congestion on one part of that path that connects the two, then then none of it's accepted?
Yeah, George, do you want to take that one also?
Yes, thank you, Debbie. Hi, Kelly. So if it is a physical right that the participant wants to exercise, the mechanism to exercise the physical right is submit a self-schedule. Then you get your higher scheduling priority. If it is a financial right and you can actually submit an economic bid, I think that's your question, what happens when you submit an economic bid? Then in that case, you don't exercise a physical right. You participate in the market economically. You may still have a financial right. So in settlements, you may get a refund of whatever congestion cost is assigned to your schedule if it is properly using the transmission contract subject to validation. So if you participate economically, and your schedule is accepted, your bid is accepted and becomes a schedule, and that schedule has a congestion cost between the source and the sink, and you have a financial right, you get back that congestion cost, and basically that's how the financial right works. And if you are not scheduled, your bid is not taken because there are other more economic bids to clear the market. Then in that case, you can still keep the congestion. It depends on how the contract is structured. At that point, maybe your contract, maybe the transmission is released for the market to use. If there is depending how the contract is structured, you may still have your financial right and you may still receive it. So it depends. But these are the options, basically.
Okay, I think that distinction between the physical right versus the financial right was useful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Callie. Jeff Spires.
Hi, good morning, Deb and George. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I just wanted to provide some feedback, I think, on the general direction of the CAISO's proposal, and just at a somewhat higher level, because I think it is worth having some discussion and debate around the overall direction here. Based on this discussion and the ones in the last couple of workshops, I really view the proposal as, for the most part, asking the rest of the EIM entities or the potential participants in EDAM to adopt the CAISO's existing approach, where in effect all transmission is in, and then there is some ability through the ETC to TOR framework to carve out rights, but I would say that that is limited, or at least that the use of that in the CAISO market is limited to somewhat exceptional circumstances, as opposed to, I think, what one of the challenges is that we're facing is that we have a fully functioning OAT framework outside that will continue to exist. And the issue that I'm struggling with is it seems like the overall direction that you're describing here is that CAISO ends up becoming the central entity that's managing all of the transmission reservations and contracts across all of the different entities. CAISO's managing contracts, they're validating all of the details of ownership and contract path. The rights can only be scheduled through the EDAM or through the EIM. And I think that is really starts to sound like a full redesign of the OAT framework to me. And I'm just struggling with that approach. In my mind, a more successful design for EDAM would be to start with the concept that what we're trying to accomplish is to allow entities to communicate to the CAISO the transmission that they're able to make available on a voluntary basis. And that finding a way to do that while recognizing that the OAT framework continues to exist, all of the complexities that go along with that we talked about last time, including purchases of transmission, redirects, multiple customers, and the fact that all of this is going on after that 7-day deadline for the master file as an example. I really have a hard time visualizing how we can successfully continue to operate under that framework if we're trying to then force it all into the master file in a way that I just don't see as working. And so I guess what I would suggest is I really think we'd be better off by trying to pursue a design that is predicated on the idea that the TSPs are communicating to CAISO what is the transmission that they can make available to the market, what is the transmission that they can't make available to the market, whether it's reserved and scheduled, or perhaps it's not been scheduled yet, but it may be in the future, and they want to be able to accommodate that and carve it out. The TSPs already have the tools, they have the approaches for managing contracts, for managing scheduling, for calculating ETC. All of these things give them the tools to be able to communicate to the CAISO so that the CAISO can get the information it needs to model the dispatch and know what transmission is available and not. And I think that would be a much better starting point than what seems to be the current discussion, which I think is really asking everyone to convert into the CAISO framework. And I think, like I say, that's a challenge. So I just wanted to make that point and hear your thoughts and perhaps others as well about that.
But Jeff, I don't think we're trying to get everyone to convert. We're looking at taking the OAT rights that exist and trying to incorporate them into the EDAM market. And so the TSP would be communicating with us as to what transmission is available, what's not available, what already has rights. I agree with you at the moment. We have an internal discussion going on with if master file takes 5 to 7 days in advance, we need to have something that is going to deal with the 7 days to the 9 a.m. the day before. How does that information get told to the market so that we make sure that the transmission is saved because it's already been sold by the EDAM BAA? So, Kevin, did you want to jump in on this?
Well, I think Jeff raises an important distinction or point because, this was quite a bit of discussion around this, so I don't want to lose this thought or kind of where he's going. Again, I go back to bucket 2. I guess, Jeff, for clarification, when we say the TSP can make a decision, I go back to what we had talked about as far as bucket 3, and at least some of us adhere to the belief that if we're posting ATC, that we need to make that available if it's not sold at a certain point. So that goes in, and that to me, I'm not making a decision day to day as whether I'm going to put certain paths in unless there's some rational basis for that. But that would be a rule or something within it would have to be approved by the commission. You're mainly focused, I think, on this bucket 2 issue. I have PowerX purchases transmission on COTP or any other path. And just because I'm a TSP, do I have the ability to make that available to the CAISO? So are we focused mainly on bucket 2 is the question for that?
Thanks, Kevin. I think so just to clarify on the bucket 3, I understand that the point that you're raising that a transmission service provider may make the decision that they are making their firm unsold ATC available to EDAM, and once they've done that, they would make available whatever that calculation comes up with, not making a subjective decision about that. And that's not what I'm getting at here. And I'm not even really getting at bucket 2 specifically either. I think I'm making a broader point about the general approach we're taking to transmission holistically, both in terms of the transmission that's being made available to the EDAM, but also all of the rest of the transmission and scheduling activity that goes on outside of EDAM. Because the way that I'm interpreting this proposal is all of that has to get funneled through the master file. And I just do not see that as being at all workable. And so what I'm really getting at is more fundamentally taking a different tack on this problem and trying to say, we have an existing framework for reserving transmission, for scheduling on transmission, for calculating what transmission may or may not be available to the market. And the TSPs have existing methodologies to do that. And one of the priorities we have is maintaining that OAT framework outside of California. So how do we bring these two things together in a way that they can work together? And the challenge I'm seeing with this is that we're on one end of the spectrum, it seems, which is we're going to convert that into a current approach in the CAISO. And I think that there are just going to be numerous challenges with that. And so it's more of a fundamental question of high-level approach. I really wasn't trying to tackle the question of, what are the specific rules about making bucket 2 or bucket 3 available. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah, it really does, Jeff, and I appreciate that. And I think I haven't converged on any particular way. I think you're raising an important point. I mean, these two, which sometimes seem like oil and water, have to somehow come together. And so, no, I get that. I just wanted to make that clarification, particularly, and I keep falling into the, I don't want to say trap, but I look at this as buckets because it makes sense to be discrete about each individual use of transmission and what rules would apply and how that, how that might differ based on the kind of use by the TSP and the customer. So But anyway, thanks for that clarification.
Okay. All right, Doug Boccignoni, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I wonder if it would be helpful, Deb, if you could go back to the diagram that you had that showed the BAAs.
Adam, can we go back to the diagram slide?
It's a few slides back. What I'm wondering is if I'm trying to put this in context. You know, my clients have rights on the California-Oregon transmission project, and I think if I'm visualizing this, there really would be 3 BAAs. Think about BAA 1 if that were BPA, and then the rights. I think that first segment, instead of A to B going all the way into BAA 2, it really goes to the boundary of BAA 1, BAA 2. Say bank, and then the rights go from Captain Jack to Tracy, and then that's a connection from bank to CAISO, which would be BAA3, which isn't on this diagram. And it would be helpful to me in a future discussion if we could talk about how that overlay would apply for the description that you gave, because in that scenario, the rights holders, I think, are potentially different for the rights between the generator and scheduling point A, and between A and my new B at the bank boundary, and between the new B and a point C between bank and CAISO. And I would help me understand better what you envision with the approach that you described, and maybe I think it sounds like Jeff has a different vision of how that might be applied.
Okay, I think that it's going to be the same thing. There's internal transmission within a BA that's used, and then there's transfer capabilities, transfer rights across BAs, whether you go across one BA or 2 BAs. In essence, it's still a transfer right, and then there's internal transmission rights that are used after that. So all I'm trying to distinguish in the example is that the internal transmission right is different than the transfer right and the buckets that we've been talking about, because we've been commingling in our whole discussion internal transmission rights and transfer rights. And so I'm trying to bring the discussion up to the level that the buckets are only for the transfer rights and not for the internal transmission, because the internal transmission is taken care of underneath the full network model and not as part of the buckets.
But I think in this case, the transfer rights to me get a little confusing because of the nature of the PACI rights. You have rights north of the border that are held by different entities in one BAA. You have rights on the COT project, which sort of touch those two, bank and BPA, and then also touch CAISO. And so there's really sort of 3 BAAs involved. And I'm just thinking about like how, in the EIM, the transfers go from, the value goes from, between the source and sink BAA. In this case, there's 3 BAAs. How does that factor in? And how, the schedules are kind of they're happening, at least on the COT, they're happening kind of at the boundaries of BAAs, but it then allows you to cross, get between 3 different BAAs potentially, depending on how you schedule those rights. And I think that's a slight complication to the discussion. It would be helpful to explore that. Not necessarily right this minute, but because I think it requires some thought.
Okay, George, did you have any thoughts on that?
Hi, Debbie. Hello. So I'm struggling a little bit to understand what this particular example is. From what I heard, it looks like we have coordinated rights, perhaps across multiple paths. And in this example, for this transmission contract that is shown by Debbie in the slide, you may have three parts of the contract path. One of them involves a transfer. So if I heard the example well, you could have a more complicated situation where you can have multiple transfers between multiple BAAs, maybe three BAAs, maybe you have another generator in BAA 3 that uses also some part of the transfer between A and B, but it's between BAA 3 and BAA 2. So we obviously support the concept of the transfer between any pair of BAAs. So we'll have to have a different transfer defined for the third BAA, and that could be part of the contract path in a more complicated fashion. We'll have to see some specifics about this particular example, but I don't think it's insurmountable to actually support it. As we described here, this methodology of defining what is the contract and what is the contract path is quite flexible. So we can include potentially multiple transfers in the contract path. It's just more complicated, but fundamentally it's not different than what we're showing here in a simpler way. But I understand how complex this.
Yeah, I agree that it should be doable. I think it's important to walk through the detail though, because and then the COD example I think is a particularly interesting one because on the BPA system, the right holders on the PACI, they get to a certain point on the path, and then it's a different set of rights holders from that point south. And depending on, in today's world, that those rights can be used to schedule into bank, or they could be used to schedule into CAISO. And so you have this unique mechanism where you potentially could have a different, sync BAA depending on how the rights were used, which I think creates some interesting things that need to be thought through depending on how the settlements work in the EDAM versus in, if it's being used in the fashion that I think Jeff has in mind.
Okay, maybe it's good to clarify something here. I think what we're showing here is how a contract can be used, can be exercised with the submission of self-schedules. And this assumes that this contract is going to use the underlying transmission capacity that in the transfer case has to be released as either bucket 1 to be used in RSC or bucket 2 or bucket 3 as the next slide shows here. But this is a little different from releasing transmission capacity to EDAM, which is basically, this is the transmission capacity that I have as a transmission customer, as a transmission owner, and I release it to EDAM, and I get to have the transfer revenue, either be it from congestion or from a usage fee. But this is basically transmission that I make available to the market for use, and I get some transfer revenue in return. This is a little bit different in the sense that this is the transmission capacity that I release to EDAM, and I intend to use it for my contract. I need to exercise my contract, which along with the release of the transmission capacity, I submit soft schedules in the market that say, okay, this is how I'm going to use this. So those two are a little different, and I want to make sure that we are, seeing the distinction between those two. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. I guess what I'm interested in is understanding both of those concepts. And I think this, even for the one you just described, I don't think it's, I guess I'm not following, like if I think about the COT, let's say it has been made available as bucket 2 to the EDAM, just given how those rights exist, is that going to be treated as syncing in, let's say it's from north to south, syncing in bank or syncing in CAISO?
Well, I would think that we'll have to examine what the rights are, and if there are rights that they go either to bank or to the ISO, some sort of delineation is in place. Maybe we can define different transfers. One transfer between, let's say, BPA and bank. The other is a transfer between BPA and the ISO. We allow the release of the transmission capacity on these transfers as the owners or customers want to do, and it's declared in the market by submitting the scheduling limit on these transfers on whoever is the appropriate entity to specify that scheduling limit, which essentially indicates how much transmission capacity is released on each transfer. And in the case that we're talking here, that some of that transmission capacity is intended to be used for, let's say, a contract with physical rights, then this piece comes into place where, okay, you have this transfer, and I'm also submitting, these self-schedules that they intend to use an amount, or I don't know, maybe all of it, for my contract, which I want to exercise by using this transmission capacity that is made available on the transfer. So there are different ways to do it. There's a certain level of flexibility. I think we don't want to get boggled down in details. So I think we want to present here a general framework on how this can be done. And again, I want to differentiate between the case of just making transmission available to the market versus, on top of that, I also want to exercise my right to use the transmission for myself with self-schedules that I submit. So,
thanks, George.
Okay, great. Steve Greenleaf, you have a question or? Yep, there you go.
Yeah. Thanks, Deb and George, and good morning, everyone. This discussion's been illuminating, and I'm thinking more and more that I kind of agree with Jeff from PowerX on kind of the need for clarity, and that the CAISO clearly, and Deb, you specifically, have been dealing with managing legacy ETC TOR rights for 24 years, 25 years. I know the CAISO is very comfortable with that. It does seem like that, approach and vernacular is trying to be extended beyond the CAISO now, which gets into further complicated details, as you mentioned, on master file. And so instead of under an old framework where you're kind of identifying PORs, PODs, you're now dealing with supply and CLAPs, so which is a further complicating detail. But and Deb, your statement on really the buckets are dealing with BA to BA transfers. I guess I kind of get that, but I also don't get it, because to me, which kind of goes back several weeks when I asked for kind of the universe of what bucket 2 is, because I'm still presuming that there's long-term firm rights, EDAM entity that I guess you would view as internal,
Right.
that wouldn't fall into now what I'm hearing bucket 2. So it's effectively up to that EDAM entity, BAA, to manage those and ensure those get honored. which I guess must be reducing the amount of bucket 1 and bucket 3 they make available then, because they've got to honor those rights. And how that is actually done, I mean, I am curious to hear from, whether it's Dave Rubin or Kathy, just somebody out there who, because it seems like to me, it's tilting back a little bit to where I think Jeff was pointing is maybe that EDAM entity's really got to manage the transmission and kind of communicate that to the ISO as opposed to third-party participants communicating that directly to the CAISO. But anyway, I'll stop there and just add, I guess one specific ask maybe, and not to put it on all the potential EDAM entities, but it would be nice to walk through very specific examples of, number one, how they manage, how they intend, take a existing customer, obviously without identifying that, and say, okay, here are some rights, point A to point B, internal to that BAA. How do they see that working? And then really the same thing with even the BAA to BAA transfers, because even under this construct you're talking about, it's still not clear to me how, say there's somebody with BA to BA transfer rights under kind of an OAT agreement, long-term rights agreement, who that it's a third-party customer, they have rights, they want to schedule on that, using your ECN construct, they do that. Well, okay, under the OAT rights, say they don't schedule on that on a day-ahead basis. I think per Dave Rubin's comment the other day, and I may have misunderstood him, under the OAT, if they don't schedule it, it gets released as non-firm at a minimum. And of course, if that non-firm schedule, as the ISO sees it, gets accepted, it's effectively treated as just like any other schedule and is firm. So it's now quasi-firm, so to speak, accepted, runs into real time. That rights holder wants to schedule using the ECN number in real time. It has that right up to T-20, let's say, and does so. Well, it then kicks that schedule off, right? Because it is non-firm under the OAT, but it's anyway. Without belaboring that, I think it would be very helpful to get some very specific examples, because your example here and what you walked through, it is helpful. Notwithstanding Doug's questioning, but really need some specific examples because it's still, between internal BA to BA and then kind of how that terms and conditions and usage is going to translate to the CAISO and how that is back and forth. So anyway, sorry for that, but I think we really need specific examples in a future workshop, just to understand the breadth and the magnitude of kind of the issues Jeff is talking about.
Okay, yeah, and we're just trying to come up with an approach that allows the EDAM BAAs to identify what transmission is available. And we heard from everybody that we have existing contracts that we need to honor. So we're trying to blend that together so that the transmission service provider can go ahead and let us know what's available for the market and what's not available for the market. And then we heard from, Steve, you and customers like you, that you want to be perfectly sure that your existing rights are being honored and not being used by somebody else in the market. So, Jeff is right on track with trying to go ahead and blend the OAT world with how do we do that in EDAM and acknowledge the longer-term existing rights that people have, the joint ownership rights that people have, and then the short-term OAT transactions that take place within, the 7-day period. So
Yeah,
I think,
and Deb, and yeah, and I agree with that. But I think it comes down to kind of Jeff's point of taking it up a level, just to understand truly the balance of burdens and benefits. Because up until this, I was kind of thinking, once again, with a potential third-party rights holder perspective engagement, and I'm thinking that third-party right is engaging in is bidding into the CAISO market that's obviously certain one way to do it, or is it more a case of that third party, especially I'm talking outside the ISO, is dealing really only with the BA, the TSP, and that the BA/TSP, and it's really not interfacing with the CAISO at all. It's just
okay.
I'm getting a little confused on kind of where that balance is, and I am curious how the EIM and the EDAM entities and Dave Rubin see that balance working. Were they thinking, hey, it's more the market operator, the CAISO that's managing all the transmission issues, or is it NVE in one instance really managing that and then communicating that to the CAISO? Because I've kind of heard both. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Qatar, you had a comment or question?
Debbie, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on what Jeff Spires said. There is really no need to talk about significant need to redesign auto operation of participating BAAs. How are you going to submit tag schedules to CalISO? It doesn't have to go to master file. It can go like today through normal tagging environment. So there is nothing in the design currently that requires people to change to anything what CAISO does, except that market has to respect bilateral schedules with protection penalties for firm transactions from bilateral market. And that is no extra work for participating BAAs to tell anything to CAISO. So the only big significant change is what Dave Rubin said before, is that there is overlapping time like in EIM between T-40, T-20, when you kind of provided ATC to market that you keep selling it. And similar aspect is in their head, and what I heard that you're thinking about pausing selling transmission between market clearing between 9 and 1 p.m. in the morning. So Jeff is making some pretty big statements that are kind of fundamental to understand. And it will be good if he starts giving specifics what major redesign in node framework he's talking about. Now, looking into your diagrams, Debbie, this aspect of transmission and how this works with spot market, bilateral and spot market together is very important to clarify. I really appreciate you start putting examples, and I will encourage that you put more examples, including wheeling scenarios, because wheeling is also something that is coming from bilateral market. It will be very important to put use cases in framework of existing bilateral transmission services. Like, I'll just give you an example that we discussed at length with BPA when we're doing EIM discussions. If you have network services and you're delivering to load internally, that's one scenario. If you have network services and you want to sell portion of capacity outside of that BA where you have that, is different scenario. So to cover all those scenarios and then link to the buckets is going to be much more clear what's going on, and it'll be very obvious that you don't have to make fundamental changes in node. And in that respect, I remember our discussion with Dave Rubin. Dave Rubin knows all the pitfalls of this and what needs to be adopted. And that was not that big in EIM. It should not be that big in EDAM. And by the way, the darker dog that you have is very good looking.
All right, thank you. Jeff, did you want to respond to Petar? Jeff, are you on double?
Sorry. Yeah, I double muted. Apologies. Nice to hear from Petar. It's been a while. I won't belabor this. I actually think what Steve suggested before about examples and getting into the details would be helpful. But I mean, the comments that I am making, or earlier this morning, are responding to my understanding of all of the presentation materials and the discussions we've been having over the last few workshops around, the concept of the way that you reserve or that transmission contracts need to be registered in the master file in order to be prioritized, and then schedules on those rights need to be made through the market. And so I think, some of Petar's comments that none of that is necessary and is, I guess, confusing me to some extent, because it seems different than what we're talking about in terms of the proposal here. So yeah, it could be that I have a misunderstanding, but I think a lot of the discussion we've been having so far seems to be related to the concept that all of that reservation information needs to get registered through the master file in order for it to be honored. And so that's where my comments around the OAT redesign came from, because that's how I'm interpreting this. So anyhow, that was my just short response, but I think, be happy to walk through examples and get a better understanding of exactly what the proposal is. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for both Doug and Petar on the suggestions for the examples. That's greatly appreciated. We can bring back more examples to subsequent meetings. Let me see, Kathleen Colbert.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Mr. Corp. First, I want to say it is great to hear Petar's voice. So that was a really nice pleasure of the morning. So I appreciate that. And I also really appreciate the functionality that Petar flagged. I agree with what Jeff just said, though, that it seems inconsistent with some of the concepts that I've been getting out of these working group meetings from the CAISO proposal, which to some extent is why, Mr. tried to elevate the conversation a bit a few meetings ago and put forward not really an alternate framework, but a framework that meets the goals and the spirit of what Jeff is raising today, that we need to be mindful of OAT, think about it, think about a framework that integrates the areas that are under OAT and have to comply with their OATs into an EDAM with functionality that we have that is simpler. And it also ties into a principle I heard Jeff say about how the areas that are under OAT have these tools. They know how to identify and manage their own contract application, their designated network resource application processes. I think a lot of what we put forward leverage the idea that they have that information that they can transmit to the EDAM market operator. And Petar, in case you didn't follow that meeting, very, very similar to what you just laid out. We proposed a pre-day ahead scheduling process for e-tags so that e-tags could be used, tied to the specific transmission to set priorities in the market so the market could respect those priorities. That's very consistent with what I heard. The suggestion that Petar just gave completely resonates with me. That's why we put a framework forward that does that. And so I think what we're hearing is maybe if we could take a step back, do those examples, but also give a chance for additional iteration on the framework that we put forward that kind of starts with how do we integrate OAT in a way and leveraging these different types of functionality. That would be really great. I don't know how we go forward in this process, though, and do that, Deb. So I know we put the proposal forward. I think it achieves a lot as a starting place of some of the concerns raised today and incorporates pretty much exactly Petar's recommendation. for where to start. How do we create space to talk more about that idea?
So good question. We've got, the discussion today. We've already have the congestion transmission revenue distribution discussion set up for Tuesday. We're now adding in additional examples to pull forward for subsequent meetings. So we'll just have to see where that can get sandwiched in. I think the challenge with the e-tags is that the structure the CAISO has at the moment, and George, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't take in e-tags into any of our systems. So that would be a whole new structure that would have to be put in place, even if you're tagging the day before the day ahead market. So good question.
Maybe I can add to this too. I don't think the issue is how we can receive e-tag information. I think obviously we can develop a system to receive this information. The real question is how to use it. What does it mean for the market? And we have repeatedly mentioned here that the structure that the market has in this multi-BAA concept, the fundamental element, the atom of the molecule, if you wish, to put it this way, is the BAA. So we see the BAA as the piece that you put in the puzzle and you connect BAAs together to form the picture. Inside the BAA, the market does not have the concept of tags or transmission that is used for specific purpose, reserved or released, or there is no such a concept in the market inside the BAA. That concept exists between BAAs, and this is where the concept of the transfer comes into place. The transfer that we're talking about here is exchange between either of capacity or energy between BAAs that requires underlying transmission. And all our discussion regarding the buckets was about how this particular transmission between BAAs is released through the transfer mechanism. And the scheduling limit on the transfer that is somehow defined, what we're proposing right now is to have this defined in the master file in advance. That's a convenience for the market. If it is becoming increasingly important to have some transient definition, we can look into supporting that, and the scheduling limit that is anyway dynamic in nature can be submitted before the market to tell us how much transmission capacity is released on the transfer between BAAs. There is no concept for transmission that is reserved or released inside the BAA. I don't know how many times I have to state this. Once the full network model is submitted to the market, all the transmission is available. Even if we have some concept of receiving a tag that says that there is some customer that is using internal transmission from point A to point B, I don't know what this information can do to the market. Yes.
Okay, because you're asking fabulous questions, and I'm hearing you, and I think you, and I think that it's such the right next step, right? To ask, well, how do we connect the information that you're getting from the e-tags to the actual market process? And I think, and I'll say we need your expertise in helping us to work through these details, but conceptually, the request that I think was put out here is, it's not just the e-tags. The e-tags just show that a specific resource on that e-tag has reserved or has a certain treatment that holds the right to get priority access to the capability through the market dispatch by reflecting penalty prices that reflect the relative difference in priority of these different types of rights. And I know that we need to collaborate as a group here to translate what we have today for our penalty factors that apply to, let's say, self-schedules and load, and work with you to show, okay, here's some new levels that we need. Here's where it would be relative to some of our existing penalty prices. What do you recommend is a good delta, around our existing penalty prices? For really what we're saying is take your self-schedule priorities today, and we're adding a few additional flavors so that there's nuances that those E-tags will show, different product types, but it's all going to be defined to penalty prices that you've set in your market. So there is a mapping exercise. On our proposal, we've tried to put forward a very simple one. And I recognize it's not getting to the level of detail on the penalty factors relative to what we have in our market today to give you assurance. And so happy to work through that. But that is the next step, is taking the general concept of the relative priority, giving the examples of the different types of so here's the self-schedule, its tag says this. So what's the penalty price associated with that? Where does it sit now in the stack? That's exactly what we need to do to start to work through this. But I think you've hit on the nail on the head, George. It's not the E-tag alone. It's an E-tag that has a self-schedule or a base schedule or whatever you want to call a bid that has different priority levels that aren't associated with economic offers within the market. And we need to work through that hard work with you.
Thank
But
you.
Kathleen, what we're proposing here with a system of exercise on the contracts by submitting self-schedules is really answering the question about how a participant can exercise their contract. And I believe it squarely answers the issue. I don't know what an E-tag system will provide more information. Essentially, if resources self-schedule under contract, that pair of self-schedules, you can say, okay, it represents some sort of an E-tag. It doesn't matter how you call it. The information has to go in the market, and all the story about the penalties is semantics. Is what penalty we assign to the self-schedule to make sure that it has its relative priority correct in competing for getting the transmission capacity. So I think we have answered all these questions. I think we're probably tripping on another issue here.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we're cross-talking because you're talking about contracts and having to manage contracts, where we're approaching this problem from the perspective of there are transmission priorities that are associated with certain resources or offers. And it is a different way of looking at it. And like in our view, you don't need to get into the business of having the contracts being registered because that's already happened in that BAA. All we need to do is have the ability for that BAA, let's say they have an external resource that's a designated network resource. If the way to do it is, I think our proposal says that they'll just be offered as non-participating resources, and that'll be considered equivalent to getting that highest, showing that is being serviced by NITS, and so it gets the highest firm priority. If you wanted them to submit an E-tag showing that external resource is on NITS, that's fine. That wasn't a part of our proposal, but I'm trying to highlight that it's just more flexible. It's a non-participating resource offer, or it's an E-tag with then a self-schedule on it. And I think the other thing that we're cross-talking on is there's more than one type of transmission. So there's not just contracts. There's not physical rights only. There's reservations that folks have that have various priority levels based on what type of product they reserved. And that's why there's just more flavors that we need to work through. But I recognize we're cross-talking. I recognize this is an alternate framework that starts with OAT and makes it work within a full network model versus kind of starting with the full network model and trying to expand it. I'm just asking for a chance if other folks think it's worth starting with an OAT integration-like proposal, if we can iterate on it.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Let's go ahead and move on. Milos, you wanted to chime in on this?
Yes, good morning, everybody. This is Milos with the California ISO, and I just wanted to acknowledge the direction of the discussion and some of the good suggestions and the need for additional examples. I think we've heard you. We're going to go back and put together some scenarios, examples, and, you know, if folks don't mind, you know, I may reach out to you, Jeff Spires, and maybe some of the other EIM entities to just help craft a couple of examples that we can walk through and have a robust conversation in an upcoming meeting here next. I think, you know, the overarching questions that seem to come up are ultimately under the buckets concept. If we're continuing with the buckets concept, is who's making that, you know, how does the market notify that transmission is available, and what transmission is available, and who's performing that function. And we also, I think, heard the need to account or have the ability to account for existing commitments, and you know, under bucket 2, for example, parties have voluntarily the ability to provide transmission to the EDAM, but also the desire to recognize some of those existing commitments if they're not made available. So what's the process for that? I think we've heard some ideas and that there may be different approaches for that. So just want to acknowledge that discussion and acknowledge that we heard you for the need for additional examples and to have that more robust discussion and maybe break it down on a bucket by bucket concept as well as different types of transmission arrangements, like others have suggested, wheel throughs, internal transmission, and then transfer transmission as well. So we'll take that as a takeaway from the ISO team. We'll work on putting together some examples. And like I said, we may reach out to you, Jeff, and maybe other EIM entities just to help us craft some realistic scenarios that we can then walk through and figure out some of these thornier questions.
All right, Jen Strack, you had a comment? Operator, could you unmute Jan Strack?
Thanks. Hey, this is Jan from San Diego Gas Electric, and actually, Milos kind of said what I was going to say, but I actually think it'd be really helpful if we could hear some very specific examples from PowerX as to what, you know, transmission services they have that don't fit with what the ISO is proposing here. I don't understand how they can't make those work. So it'd be really good to see an example where that's the case. The only thing I've heard so far that I think is a little bit challenging, and I think George has already said that's something we could work on, which is this stuff within 1 week. So it's in the master file, but yet, you know, there needs to be the ability to update within the 1 week time frame. I think that's something where we could do a little more thinking, but fundamentally, I'm still missing what it is that cannot be accommodated, what transmission rights cannot be accommodated through this mechanism. And I think this is one last point that I think we need to understand here, that the whole concept here is that we're trying to convert rights into economic parameters. And that ability is squarely within the BA's control. They can bid however they choose. So if they want power to flow, regardless of what the prices are, they can bid in a way to make that happen. I don't think that's a very smart thing to do, but it can be done. So I just think we need to be, you know, mindful about the basic structure of what the ISO is trying to set up here. Thanks.
Right. And the intent is to take care of both, you know, short-term transactions along with longer-term transactions. And as I started out, you know, we need to figure out how to deal with transactions between the 7-day and up to the 9 a.m. For the day-ahead market. So anybody else have any other comments, thoughts, questions on the example? Because the next thing I wanted to do is go to the scoping document. Okay, operator, could you go ahead and give me sharing rights, please? Hold on a second while I get this all arranged. Yeah. Is that big enough for people?
I think it looks good, Debbie.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, Debbie, I see a couple hands raised. Oh, they've lowered that back down. Thanks.
Okay, perfect.
And Deb, this is Phil. Can we maybe make it a little bit bigger?
Sure.
There we go.
All right. So we went through bucket 1 and bucket 3 on Tuesday. And in essence, we've got bucket 2 left. What I'd like to do is set aside the issue of whether bucket 2 cost recovery is greater than the congestion, because I think that we're going to have, oops, hold on a second. Something's got the dogs all rattled up. too much background noise, the challenges of working from home. I'd like to go ahead and set aside whether there should be additional cost allocation for bucket 2 until we go through the presentation on Tuesday, and just talk more about the nature of the bucket 2 transmission, how it's made available, and how it's optimized in the market, and try to go through the outstanding questions on bucket 2. So with that, what we have so far is that its transmission proposal is it's voluntarily made available. We'll set aside whether it's congestion rents or something other than that. So let me just highlight that. And it can be unscheduled, firm, point-to-point, and cost. The original intention of the principles was that the cost was recovered through the existing out process. So the purchaser of the transmission or the excess transmission that's available, the cost is recovered through that, which is why it's just congestion rents. Then the expectation is the market would only be allowed to use unscheduled firm point-to-point reservations that are made available, or firm transmission that everyone is confident can be redispatched in real time to the extent that the entity, the existing rights holder, does want to go ahead and use their transmission rights. So this is more referencing the WSBP Schedule C transmission. And then again, we need to preserve out rights that already exist. You know, we've had that discussion all the way through. But once a customer or the transmission provider makes transmission available to the EDAM optimization and it's used in the EDAM optimization, then it can't be pulled back in real time. Intraday changes would be allowed to the extent that congestion rent, again, the cost is up for grabs by the scheduling entity bidding it in the EIM. And then lastly, the transmission customer would make it available. There's no incremental transmission charge. Charges are still up for grabs. If it's not used in the EDAM, then it would be given back to the customer to be able to post it on their Oasis or sell it intraday in advance of the EIM. And then I think we've already gone through a number of times what would happen if the customer doesn't want to make it available, then in essence it's self-scheduled, the load and resource in the EDAM. And so that's what we've got for bucket 2. Steve, you have a comment or question? Steve Greenleaf? Operator, can you open his line?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Just a clarification here. So per your earlier statement, and once again, I'm not sure I agree with this, but do you, would you right up front define bucket 2 as existing rights, third-party rights from one BAA to another?
Yes.
And then maybe we should make explicit in here that existing rights internal to a BAA, maybe it's a parenthetical afterwards, existing rights internal to a BAA will be managed by that BAA and presumably would not qualify for any kind of compensation outside of their existing rights to assign and or resell that transmission. And I presume, Deb, we're going to come back at some point, and maybe it's part of the examples that you guys can come back with on how those internal rights or rights internal to a BAA are going to be managed.
Yes.
I'm not asking that you put that here, but okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This whole process needs to be an iterative process because of what's going on with the other working groups. So to the extent that we could get a sort of consensus at this point, then we can move on to dealing with other subject matters that the work group needs to tackle, and then go ahead and obviously come back to the whole proposal once we have a better idea of what the other groups are going to be doing.
Yeah, okay.
All right,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Steve. Kathleen?
Thanks. Maybe just the first paragraph, because I think I just want to echo that kind of what Steve was saying. Some of the details below, I think, hinge off of the high level stuff you have in paragraph 1. So I'm just going to focus on trying to help there, if that's okay. So I think a clarification that would be helpful in your first sentence, Steph, is that, because I've been distinguishing in my discussions with folks between transmission reservations or rights that are resold versus donated. This sentence, to me, gets at the donated type, which I think voluntarily says, but I just wanted to note, in my mind, it's in that donated category. So folks, third parties who own those or have those reservations rights voluntarily donate them. And so maybe that's the compensation for that. And I think part of the reason you have that as an open item is I would actually save space and add a new first sentence for transmission rights that are sold or resold through a competitive solicitation process for use by EDAM as a separate type that we've been talking about, and I don't see that competitive solicitation there.
Yeah. Does somebody from the CAISO team want to talk about the CAISO stance on competitive solicitation?
This is Miloš with the ISO. I'm not sure, what's the context here for competitive solicitation. I don't know if Kathleen, you can elaborate on that, but we were not envisioning there's competitive solicitation here within these buckets.
That would be outside of what the CAISO does. If some entities wanted to do a competitive solicitation, that would be outside of what gets offered in bucket 2 for EDAM.
Yeah, I mean, the starting concept for bucket 2 was transmission is voluntarily made available. I want to make a distinction between this donated concept. Donated, I think, I would equate it to free, not subject to compensation. But what we're referring to in bucket 2 is transmission is voluntarily made available, and then in return for congestion rents as that starting compensation point.
And operator, I think we lost Kathleen Colbert. If you open her line, operator.
Thanks, operator. Appreciate that. So in this year's proposal, which is an alternate framework that's been proposed, we are proposing a competitive solicitation process. We provided that context during our presentation. I can certainly do my presentation again if everyone wants to go through it again. But that joke aside, what I'm requesting is we not lose the fact that I haven't been interpreting this as a consensus document, but more as a document that records what we're contemplating as options. And it is an option that's been proposed in this process, and I'd ask that we not lose it. The reason that it was proposed that the CAISO or an EDAM operator perform it is because that was the feedback the EDAM entities gave during these working groups. And I don't mean to point to you, but I believe it was Kathy who gave the feedback that they would want the EDAM operator to perform that instead of having them in between the third party and the EDAM operator. And so that's why we put forward the proposal the way we did. Happy to revisit who does it, but I did want to clarify, we've been talking about that multiple times. I think the context is out there in the working group. I know we got feedback on the mechanism. I know we've had feedback on the preferred entity to perform it. Just want to make sure it's not lost that this is associated with the type in bucket 2.
So Kathy or Dave, did you want to chime in on a competitive solicitation for transmission? Especially Kathy, if that's who Kathleen is in reference to.
Thanks, Deb and Kathleen. As a reminder, folks, yeah, there's Kathy in the queue.
Kathy.
Hi, yeah. So there's been so many of these conversations. I'm going to just be flat out honest and tell you I don't remember the whole concept of competitive solicitations and me saying, I would rather whatever Kathleen said I said. So it's highly likely I potentially said that. I just don't remember it with 3 work group meetings and every other meeting that we've talked about. So I just don't have a lot to say on that one, short of I don't know. Maybe Dave has a thought, but yeah.
Dave, did you have a thought on that?
My primary thought is that my idea of retirement is very different than Petter's. You almost have to sort of step back a little bit to where I think Steve, Greenleaf, and Jeff were although I would put on the table in this balance between sort of RTO world and OAT world, you know, the solution to some of the challenges that we're finding with the ETC TOR approach, and maybe that's not the path to go on. You know, if this is a maze, maybe that's a brick wall. But it, you know, one possibility may be to lean more on the RTO approach and handle things more through redispatch than carving it out. That's still there. I don't think we envisioned a competitive solicitation. Again, you know, we've talked about it in some of these work groups. Our customers today have the right to sell point-to-point transmission that they've got a firm reservation on in advance to an eligible customer with some degree of notice to us. If those customers want to engage in a competitive solicitation and tell us who the winner of that is, okay, I think that's a right that they have. But I think that's really separate and apart from what we're really trying to do here, which is an EDAM day ahead. How are we handling, you know, firm point-to-point across an intertie? I don't want to enlarge this conversation, and that really gets into, do we need to incent the holders of those existing rights to make them available to the market? And if so, what should that incentive be? Or do we not need to do it? Can we handle it the way we do today? More of you can schedule it and use it, or if you don't, sort of show up to the airplane, you know, somebody else can use it in your place, where we handle, and then again, if you come back later on, different than the airline because the plane's already left. But here, if you come back intraday down to T-20 and want to use the right that you didn't schedule the day before, again, can we handle that through redispatch? Or if not, and the transmission is valuable, as I'm sure it is in places in the West, do we need to come up with that incentive so that we're not just carving it out? But having done that, you know, we've got to try and keep this a little bit simple, a little bit implementable, and a competitive solicitation is not something for the transmission there outside of the existing processes under the oath that people have to remarket that transmission.
Right, and that's how we were looking at it, was the right to remarket is underneath the OAT. It already exists. That function is already being performed. So, and it would be in advance of the day-ahead market, EDAM, so it wasn't necessarily appropriate to add it into bucket 2. A comment from Petter, and if you could let us know who you're representing.
Hi, Debbie. Sorry, I'm representing SGM. I would like to kind of clarify a couple of things. Dave, I don't agree or disagree with anything. I'm just saying that when we raise a question like broad redesign of auto operation for EM entities, we have to specify why is that? What's happening there? Like if it is because we are forcing information to master file or there is more. I understand Jeff's point about master file. I'm just saying it doesn't have to go to master file in my mind. It doesn't go to master file today in EIM. Okay, that's number one. Number two, when we talk about RTO-like approach, when we are trying to kind of have a bilateral market, a spot market working together, you need to find a way to protect schedules, firm schedules, let's say. And there is one way how CalISO does that. We do that with, they do that, I'm not CalISO anymore. They do that by these protection cell schedules, and they have priority prices for TORs, ETCCs. But for market doesn't mean that you need to have special contract like that. You just define priorities like any other priority. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to give protection for these people who want to stay in bilateral through perfect hedge. And we had unlimited number of discussions with EM entities, and pretty much everybody was kind of saying, okay, we as EM entity will figure out, do we want to do that or not? But if there are other mechanisms how to marry bilateral market and spot market to work together and not interrupt much old framework, people should talk about that. There is a proposal, there is something on the table. If that doesn't work for whatever reason, people should talk about that. And I'm coming back to my statement earlier. I see the biggest issue, as you said many times, that people may keep selling after market clearing, either in EAM or EDAM. And if redispatch can handle that, like it's handling today in bilateral market, because today in bilateral market, when you have schedules that are causing some infeasibility, you have to redispatch or curtail based on priorities. So that mechanism needs to work in this framework where spot market and bilateral market are coexisting together.
Right. Thanks, Tar. Kathleen?
Yeah, great. No, thank you. Debbie, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just wanted to kind of respond and kind of reiterate something that we had proposed. I think there's maybe another lack of clarity in what we proposed, but our principle is that transmission capacity freed up. So what's the amount of transmission capacity made available, freed up for EDAM purposes, should be done and made available on a non-discriminatory basis to both the EDAM and third-party transmission customers outside of EDAM, as well as within the EDAM footprint. And we listed 4 different potential options for how that transmission might get freed up. Undesignating the network resources to free them up for EDAM transfers, donating point-to-point service, which you have on your document here, reselling point-to-point service, or unscheduled point-to-point service. I see those 3 things captured that I mentioned. I just don't see the reselling point-to-point service. And I wanted to put it very clearly out there, if I had not in the past, that who benefits from this is the EDAM itself. And in no way were we proposing that OAT processes change. Completely agree that third parties already have the right to go out and remarket. You know who doesn't, I believe, have the authority to pay for it is the CAISO. We need to make tariff changes in order to give the CAISO the authority to administer a process by which it would have the choice to compensate third-party transmission customers for their longer duration rights that they have for making it available through reselling to EDAM. If you decide to include this concept, it's actually the EDAM that benefits, because otherwise, I believe those third-party transmission customers will want to maintain those rights through the scheduling period we're talking about. It's by having the option to look and say, hey, can we get more efficiency? Can we get more benefits out of dispatching on this additional incremental energy as it's under EDAM to allow for more transfers by procuring those rights from those transmission customers for a value that they're willing to resell it for EDAM purposes. And so I just want to be crystal clear. It's not a matter of does a third party remarket to another third party. What's different about this EDAM conversation and why we need to talk about it in a working group is to ask the question of, do we want to consider a process by which rights that would otherwise not be donated could be compensated appropriately for selling them back to improve the overall benefits that EDAM can provide. So I felt we were losing the real reason there are tariff changes needed and who benefits out of this. I wanted to make sure that was crystal clear. It's up to this group if you don't want to get that incremental value, but that is the value, and it's worth making sure you know what you're giving up before taking it off the table.
So Kevin Smith, did you want to jump in on that? Operator, could you open Kevin Smith's line?
Thanks, Debbie. Kevin Smith, Bank. So I think, Kathleen, what you're getting at, so right now there is a mechanism that allows for an entity to donate. We say donate. Again, there's compensation. The compensation mechanism is congestion rent. And so I think, as Dave articulated, the idea or concept was that the compensation mechanism that we discussed as EDAM entities or EIM entities was around the issue of congestion rent allocation to that entity that provides transmission. That is the compensation. Now, I think as you go beyond startup, maybe you realize there could be other mechanisms or other needs. Maybe there's not sufficient transfer that's occurring, that there are paths that, you know, there's not a sufficient incentive. I think that is a reasonable issue. But I think as a matter of first course, you know, we have, at least some of us, I can't say all agree on this, but the idea was that, you know, let's see how this market operates and keep it simple, because otherwise you're getting into a much more complex concept. And again, I think CAISO does have a mechanism, but the compensation mechanism isn't a bidding and auction type compensation. It is you provide transmission, and I will exchange that for the congestion grants that are derived from that transmission path for some finite period of time.
Right. And there's already a mechanism in the OAK process to allow entities, to the extent they have that right, to resell it. So in essence, a competitive solicitation would be a duplication of what already exists today. So that was why we weren't including that. Kelly Wells, question?
Yeah, hi Debbie, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Actually, I had a more general comment. If you prefer me to defer, I can. I'm fine with waiting towards a few more minutes, if that works. Unless I'm okay, go ahead and making the comment.
Yeah, you can make a general comment. Go for it.
Okay, yeah, I just been listening to the discussions. I think it's really clear that there's still a lot of questions and clarification that would be extremely beneficial at this point. You know, I think those examples will really help clarify a lot of details and highlight where things, where there's concerns being raised. And I know we're on a tight timeline. Debbie, I know you said you guys have congestion teed up next week, but I guess I'm asking that maybe we make those examples a priority and really continue having these discussions and fleshing out the concerns and issues before we move into congestion. I'm just a little concerned that if we get to congestion, still walking down one certain framework, that there's going to be issues that arise that we'll realize down the road, and we'll have to kind of come back to this discussion. But I'm just, I guess, asking that maybe we wait until we can get a little bit more fleshed out on these details and the concerns here on just the framework in general.
Yeah, we'll see if we can go ahead and get the examples for next Tuesday and push the compensation discussion to later in the week. We'll see what we can juggle between now and next Tuesday. But
yeah, it's the examples that, yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And it's the examples as well as just continuing having these discussions. There's a lot of concerns raised on both sides. And I think really just having this discussion up front before we start talking compensation, I think is going to benefit us all in the end.
Okay. I agree with you. You know, part of it's the chicken and the egg. We can't seem to get past the first sentence unless we talk about compensation for bucket 2, and completely understand additional examples would be helpful. So we'll see what we can put together for Tuesday. Stuart Kelly, you had a comment?
I just want to second what Callie has requested here. And in these examples, I think we need to bring in, you know, in terms of what would be set up in the market contractually, and ideally just simply step through from an old perspective, a OASIS process, what's posted, what's reposted or whatever, just detailed examples, I think, will really help this discussion, because I just feel that we're spending a lot of time and stuff that's in many respects can be simplified and would actually save us a lot of time if we just had these examples from the outset. I think it's pretty clear how everyone or a subset of this group thinks this will work. So can we please have that so that everyone understands, and then we can look at the supplemental things, be it around compensation or whatever. But to move forward in this process without doing that, I think it's just going to undermine the process overall. So if we could have some specificity around these examples and just how it would work from a process standpoint, that would be extremely helpful, and happy to be involved in that.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much. Okay, I think at this point we're just a little bit before the top of the hour. So for next week, we'll go ahead and move on to quickly putting the examples together. We have the weekend, yay. So we get a couple more days in versus the Tuesday. Trying to put stuff together between Tuesday and Thursday is a bit of a challenge. So we'll try to put those examples together. We'll be reaching out to Jeff and others to get the specific examples to make sure that we're covering the various items, and then push out the compensation discussion until after we've gone through the examples. With that, unless there are any other comments, I was going to go ahead and conclude today's meeting, but just wanted to give anybody a last-minute opportunity to raise their hands. All right, seeing none. Thank you very much, everyone, for today's discussion. I think it was really helpful, and I think the additional examples will be helpful to really get into the details of what the intent is for reserving the contract rights. And you don't necessarily have to reserve your contract rights. You know, it's up to however the entity wants to deal with it. We'll also be reaching out to the EIM entities to make sure that it's consistent with how their oaths are currently working. So thank you very much to everyone today, and looking forward to our discussions on Tuesday. With the operator, I think we'll go ahead and close the discussion.
Hey, Debbie, this is Phil. Quick question. There was a question right there near the end. You probably didn't see it. It was in the chat. I forget who it was now, where he was asking this document that you're showing with the scope and the discussion. Is that posted on the website? And
yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, it is. It is posted on the website. I'll go ahead and post an updated version. I planned on posting an updated version. I typically post it at the end of the week, so the last one that was posted was as of the 13th. So I'll post what we have as of today, the 25th, probably later today or tomorrow.
Yeah. And yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
I see the chat.
All right. No worries. All right. So we'll debrief later. See ya.
All right.
That concludes our conference. Thank you so much, Deb, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your afternoon. You may now disconnect.